April 1945. The war was dying, but it refused to die quietly. In a small Bavarian town, its name half erased by artillery maps and retreat orders, an SS headquarters trembled beneath the weight of its own insignia. The once proud black and silver banner hung limp against the cold wind, flapping weakly over cracked stone and shattered glass. Inside, the marble corridors smelled of smoke, diesel, and fear. Colonel Otto von Richter, decorated, ruthless, and still draped in his iron-gray uniform, stood before a fading wall map of Germany. He traced with his finger what was left of his empire, thin red lines retreating toward oblivion. Behind him, officers murmured about American armor moving fast, too fast through the hills. Von Richter laughed. "They'll break against our walls," he said. "These farm boys don't know how to fight." But outside, the thunder was growing. The rumble of Shermans, the distant whine of P-47s, and above the smoke, through the rising dawn, a new flag would soon claim the sky. The stars and stripes were coming, and they were coming for him. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. In the east, the Red Army had crossed the Oder and was clawing its way toward Berlin. In the west, the Americans, British, and French were crossing the Rhine, one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe, turning what was once the Reich's industrial heartland into a corridor of ruin. The German army was no longer an army. It was a scattering of remnants, divisions in name only, held together by fear, habit, and the authority of men who refused to see what was plain before them. The war was lost. In the ruins of cities, civilians dug trenches beside children. Old men were drafted into the Volkssturm. In every headquarters, from Berlin to Bavaria, orders came not from reason but from delusion. The Führer demanded resistance to the last bullet. SS officers obeyed, if not out of loyalty, then from terror of what awaited them should they disobey. Colonel Otto von Richter belonged to this dying order. A veteran of the Eastern Front, he had witnessed the frozen massacres of Stalingrad and the charred bones of Kharkov. He believed the Reich could still hold its ground if only its men had the will. But by spring 1945, willpower could not stop tanks, and faith could not refill empty fuel drums. To the west, General George S. Patton's Third Army had broken through the Saar region, driving eastward with ferocity unmatched since Normandy. His divisions moved with mechanical rhythm. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers leapfrogging through towns, cutting supply routes, dismantling what remained of German resistance. Across the Moselle and the Rhine, American columns advanced through shattered villages. They met pockets of resistance, fanatical SS units, local police battalions, and hastily assembled militia, but none could halt them for long. Air superiority had turned the battlefield into a one-sided slaughter. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roamed the skies, shredding convoys before they could even retreat. Each day the front line moved eastward by miles. Entire towns surrendered before a single shot was fired. And yet inside fortified SS command posts, officers like von Richter refused to believe the map. The Reich's propaganda still echoed on broken radios. Germany fights for her survival. But survival had become an illusion. Bridges lay twisted over black rivers. Locomotives rusted where they fell. Fuel depots burned for weeks, staining the sky with a crimson haze visible for 50 miles. Even so, the SS elite held fast. To them, surrender was treason and defiance was purity. They mocked the American advance as a wave of amateurs, untested against true soldiers. Many had never seen a Sherman tank up close, only heard of them in reports that spoke of mechanical superiority, not courage. The irony was that courage no longer mattered. War by 1945 had become a contest of logistics and endurance. The Americans had both. Germany had neither. By the time von Richter's headquarters came under threat, the U.S. forces had already executed Operation Lumberjack, securing the west bank of the Rhine. Then came the audacious crossing at Remagen, where, against every expectation, the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing long enough for American engineers to rush armor across it. That single bridge sealed Germany's fate. With the river breached, the Allies poured into the heartland. Patton's tanks rolled through the Palatinate and into Franconia. Eisenhower's orders were clear: advance rapidly, encircle the Ruhr. crush the industrial spine of the Reich. The result was the Ruhr Pocket, hundreds of thousands of German troops trapped between converging American and British armies. It was the largest encirclement on the Western Front. While those men fought for survival, smaller SS units, cut off and leaderless, dug in across southern Germany, clinging to the illusion that Hitler's Alpine fortress would somehow reverse the tide. Von Richter's garrison was one of them. His headquarters stood on a hillside overlooking a Bavarian town, surrounded by forests and rolling farmland, terrain he once called ideal for defense. Now it only served to isolate him further from reality. Radio contact with Berlin had grown erratic. Some days he received no orders at all. Others, only fragments, promises of new weapons, of a counteroffensive, of loyal reinforcements that never arrived. But his pride endured. He inspected the few armored vehicles that remained, a half-destroyed Panzerfoe, 2 machine gun nests, and a handful of mortars. Against Patton's mechanized spearhead it was hopeless. Yet in his eyes, hopelessness was an insult. He told his men, "We stand here until the last breath." Those words echoed down corridors lined with cracked portraits of Hitler and Himmler. Some soldiers believed him. Others only pretended. For outside those walls, the thunder of the Allied advance was no longer distant. It was real, and it was closing in. And soon, the tide that had swallowed France crossed the Rhine and encircled the Ruhr would reach this forgotten Bavarian town. The small Bavarian town lay nestled between low wooded hills, the kind of landscape painted in peacetime postcards. But by mid-April 1945, it was a battlefield without front lines. The American Third Army's columns were sweeping southeast in a thunderous advance that seemed less like an offensive and more like gravity itself pulling the war to its end. From the north came elements of the 26th Infantry Division, men who had fought through Luxembourg and the Saar. From the west, the 11th Armored Division, the Thunderbolts, their Sherman tanks still streaked with mud from the Rhine crossing. Patton's orders were simple: drive fast, seize bridges, cut every German road before they could regroup. The 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions were pushing through Nuremberg toward Munich, rolling up the last organized resistance in southern Germany. Between those American thrusts lay a patchwork of retreating Wehrmacht remnants, SS training schools and police battalions. Communication had broken down entirely. Telephones were dead. Radios hissed with static or carried foreign voices. Orders no longer came from Berlin, but from whatever officer still had fuel and ammunition. To fight one more day, von Richter commanded what had once been a regiment of the 12th SS Panzergrenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen. Weeks of retreat had reduced it to barely 200 men, half of them wounded or teenage replacements pulled from nearby schools. They held a cluster of farmhouses, a rail yard, and the stone municipal hall that served as his headquarters. The colonel believed his position mattered. The town guarded a narrow pass leading toward Berchtesgaden, the symbolic heart of Hitler's so-called Alpine fortress. If the Allies reached it, the dream of a final redoubt in the mountains would die. So von Richter swore to hold, even as his maps became meaningless. Across the fields, the Americans had no illusions about glory. Recon reports described the place as moderately defended, another dot to secure on the march to Austria. For the 26th Infantry, it was just another mission order pinned to the hood of a jeep. Advance at dawn. Neutralize resistance. Secure the town. The terrain favored the defenders at first glance: rolling slopes, scattered pine woods, a stone bridge over a narrow river. But Allied artillery and air power erased advantages in minutes. The American forward observers could call down 105mm shells with frightening precision. What von Richter saw as fortress terrain was, to the GIs, a target grid. Still, the colonel refused evacuation. He walked the perimeter, his field coat immaculate despite the soot. "We will teach them fear," he told his adjutant. Few believed him, but no one dared contradict an SS officer whose pistol never left his belt. Inside the American command post, Captain Robert Mills studied reconnaissance photos under a canvas tarp. He had lost friends at Bastogne and seen too many villages turn to rubble. "We'll offer them surrender," he said quietly, "but if they keep shooting, we level the place." His men nodded. By April, compassion had been worn thin by months of marching past corpses and concentration camps. At dawn on April 23, 1945, the thunder began. American artillery batteries opened fire from the ridgeline west of town, short, controlled salvos that shattered windows and broke morale long before the infantry moved. Civilians huddled in cellars. German machine gunners fired blindly through smoke. Von Richter's field telephone rang only once that morning. The line crackled with a voice from an SS brigade farther east. "Hold your position. The Führer expects discipline." Then silence. Berlin itself would fall within a week, but he did not know that. By noon, American tanks appeared through the haze, low silhouettes creeping along the main road, infantry spread out behind them. The town church bell, hit by shrapnel, rang a single dull note before collapsing into its tower. To the colonel's men, it felt like the world had shrunk to a few hundred meters of mud and stone. To the Americans, it was another nameless strong point to reduce before nightfall. Both sides understood one thing clearly. The next hours would decide who lived to see the end of the war. Von Richter ordered his remaining half-track forward, its crew exhausted teenagers in oversized uniforms. It fired 2 bursts before a Sherman 75mm gun answered. The explosion tore open the courtyard of his headquarters, scattering masonry across the SS flag that still hung stubbornly above the entrance. Yet even then, the colonel refused to flee. He retreated to the map room, listening to the walls shake with each shell. Somewhere outside, a trumpet from an American armored regiment sounded the advance. By mid-afternoon, the stars and stripes were less than a mile away, and as the smoke thickened, one truth became undeniable. The war he had worshipped was ending, not with triumph, but with the slow humiliation of inevitability. Inside the dim corridors of his headquarters, Colonel Otto von Richter represented more than a man. He was the last echo of a collapsing ideology. Educated, eloquent, and utterly devoted to the Reich, he had been molded by a system that prized loyalty over life itself. For years he had watched subordinates die on the Eastern Front, while he wrote polished reports for superiors who no longer existed. The war had stripped away everything except belief, and belief by now was poison. He viewed surrender as cowardice. Even as Germany's cities burned, he still spoke of honor and duty. His officers saluted in silence, knowing the futility of it all. The corridors smelled of oil and sweat. A portrait of Himmler still hung on the wall, tilted by shock waves. Von Richter's arrogance was not madness, it was denial. To accept defeat meant admitting that everything he had lived for was a lie. His uniform still gleamed. His pistol still shone. Yet outside, the Reich itself was nothing but ash. In the final hours, he was less a commander than a man trapped inside a collapsing myth, one whose pride would lead him to face the impossible rather than face himself. For the men of the 26th Infantry Division, the advance into Bavaria was not victory, it was exhaustion. They had fought from the hedgerows of Normandy through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Many were barely in their 20s. Some were replacements who had seen their first combat only weeks earlier. They had buried friends in muddy ditches, slept under artillery fire, and crossed rivers on makeshift bridges under sniper fire. By April 1945, they no longer asked why they fought. They fought because stopping meant dying. They fought because orders said to advance. The romantic ideals that had filled the recruiting posters were long gone, replaced by the mechanical rhythm of survival. Yet when they reached German villages, they saw something that reignited their purpose. Civilians starved and silent. Train cars filled with skeletal prisoners liberated from camps nearby. The smell of atrocity clung to the wind. The men realized the war was not just about borders. It was about what kind of world would exist when it was over. So when intelligence reported SS resistance ahead, there was no hesitation. SS meant fanaticism. SS meant no mercy. They loaded extra ammunition, checked bayonets, and prepared for another grim task. But beneath the hardness, humanity remained. Some still wrote letters home by candlelight. Some carried photographs tucked under their helmets. And all of them, every one, wanted the same thing: to survive the final push home. World War II was no longer a soldier's war, it was a war of machines. The Americans had mastered it. The Sherman tank, once mocked by German commanders as a coffin for 5 brothers, now dominated through sheer numbers and coordination. For every Tiger or Panther the SS had left, the Allies could field 10 Shermans supported by mobile artillery, air reconnaissance, and engineers who could rebuild bridges overnight. The battlefield outside von Richter's town was a symphony of logistics. Convoys of half-tracks, jeeps bristling with radios, trucks carrying endless shells. Overhead, the sky was owned by the United States Army Air Forces, P-47. Thunderbolts prowled like hawks, strafing roads and convoys before they could regroup. What von Richter didn't grasp was that courage had become irrelevant against such an engine. His defense plan, machine guns, mortars, and a single half-track, belonged to an earlier war. The Americans didn't need to assault him directly. They could crush his position from miles away, guided by maps and aerial photographs that saw everything. It was technology that had transformed the Allied soldier into an unstoppable force. Every tank had radios. Every artillery unit could coordinate by grid. Every infantry platoon was part of a larger, precise rhythm. Germany, once the master of mechanized warfare, was now outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by its own invention, the modern military machine. The battlefield was small, barely a kilometer across, but its outcome was already written. Tactically, von Richter's defense was textbook by 1940 standards, suicidal by 1945. His men were spread thin, with no reserves, no air support, and no escape routes. He positioned machine guns at crossroads, mortars on rooftops, and snipers in bell towers. In another era, these defenses could have stalled an advance. Now they were markers for American artillery. The 26th Infantry's approach was methodical. Forward scouts marked positions, calling back coordinates to field guns dug in on the western ridge. The first American shells fell with clockwork precision, destroying roadblocks, silencing a machine gun nest, collapsing the church tower where von Richter's sniper team had waited. The colonel countered with what little he had. His remaining radio operator relayed a plea for reinforcements that would never come. He ordered small counterattacks, brief bursts of defiance that were annihilated by tank fire. Every maneuver exposed his weakness further. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had turned the fight into geometry, triangulating fire, cutting off alleys, using smoke screens to mask infantry movement. The colonel's troops, half-trained boys in SS uniforms too large for them, were soon isolated, each fighting their own private battle among the ruins. There was no grand strategy, only delay. But even delay had lost meaning. The American lines closed in from 3 directions, and the SS command post, once the proud nerve center of discipline, became a bunker of panic and echoing gunfire. War doesn't end when bullets stop. It ends when belief dies. For the SS, belief was everything. From the first day of training, they had been taught that surrender was shame, that mercy was weakness. They were the elite, chosen to embody the will of the Reich. But as the shells fell closer, even that identity began to fracture. Some of von Richter's men broke ranks and fled toward the forests. Others threw down their weapons and emerged with trembling hands raised. The colonel saw it as betrayal. They saw it as survival. The iron discipline of the SS, the myth that had terrorized Europe, was dissolving in smoke and rubble. Inside his headquarters, von Richter stood before a shattered mirror. The reflection staring back at him was not the hero of propaganda posters, but an aging man with dust in his hair and fear in his eyes. He had told his men they would die for the fatherland. But the fatherland no longer existed. Berlin was burning. The Führer was hiding. And outside the enemy he had mocked, the amateurs, the farm boys, Kuss was proving unstoppable. For the Americans, the psychology was different but no less heavy. They had seen too much death to celebrate it. Many had liberated concentration camps only days earlier. They fought now not from hatred, but from the grim knowledge of what ending this regime meant. Each advance brought them closer to finishing something unspeakable. When prisoners finally emerged from the SS building, young, scared, some crying, the Americans didn't cheer. They just kept moving forward, checking rooms, clearing streets, doing what had to be done. The moral victory was not one of glory, but of exhaustion. In every war, there comes a moment when a symbol replaces a sentence, when a flag speaks louder than any commander. As the fighting ended, an American platoon raised the stars and stripes over the SS headquarters. The fabric caught in the wind, its colors stark against the gray smoke curling from the roof. For the men watching, it wasn't triumph, it was silence. The flag did not mark conquest. It marked the end. Colonel von Richter saw it from the shattered window of his office. The same window from which he had once surveyed his defensible town. The same window before which he had mocked the Americans only days earlier. Now the banner he had despised fluttered above his own command post. Witnesses later recalled him standing motionless, lips trembling, eyes locked on the flag. His aide whispered something, perhaps a plea to flee, perhaps a prayer, but the colonel didn't answer. He removed his cap, laid it on the table, and sat down in silence. The war for him was over. For the Americans, that flag carried a different weight. It was the same banner that had flown over Normandy, over Bastogne, over the shattered bridges of the Rhine. It represented the long march, the blood, the exhaustion, and the unspoken promise that tyranny would not endure forever. That day, the stars and stripes over a Bavarian town symbolized not just a military victory, but a moral one, the triumph of endurance over arrogance, of perseverance over ideology. The dawn of April 24, 1945 began under a shroud of smoke. The hills around the town glowed orange from scattered fires that refused to die. Shells from the 105s had cratered the main road into a line of smoldering pits. In the distance, American armor idled, waiting for orders to move in. Inside the SS headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. Von Richter's officers stood around a table littered with burnt maps, radio parts, and untouched rations. Every few minutes, the building trembled from the shock of another near hit. The colonel paced in silence, his gloves blackened from soot, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and disbelief. A junior officer spoke hesitantly. "Sir, the Americans are at the bridge." Von Richter didn't look up. "Then destroy it." But there was nothing left to destroy it with. The engineers who had carried the last explosives were already dead, or had fled during the night. The river crossing, a narrow stone bridge at the edge of town, was now a gateway for American tanks. At 700 hours, the first Shermans advanced across it. Infantry spread out in staggered lines, covering every approach. The Americans moved with patience, no rush, no bravado, just the slow certainty of an army that knew victory was inevitable. German machine gun fire erupted from a farmhouse on the left flank, briefly halting the advance. Within minutes, the farmhouse vanished under a salvo from a tank's main gun. One of von Richter's squads tried to counterattack across the street. 4 men in tattered uniforms clutching Panzerfausts. None made it past the first corner. The colonel's defenses were dissolving like frost under fire. He climbed to the roof to see for himself. The view was apocalyptic. The town's rooftops shrouded in dust. Telephone poles snapped like matchsticks. American armor crawling forward like silent beasts through the haze. He still refused to retreat. He shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of artillery. Down below, his remaining troops were fighting not for ideology but for breath. At 08:30, the Americans broke through the western perimeter. Tanks fanned out along the main square, their turrets swiveling methodically. The sound of 50-caliber machine guns echoed between buildings. Tearing into brick walls where German soldiers hid, civilians screamed from cellars. Dogs barked in panic. Von Richter ordered the SS flag raised higher. As a sign of defiance, he said. His adjutant hesitated. "Sir, the men are surrendering." "Then they are no longer men," von Richter snapped. Moments later, an American artillery shell struck the upper floor. The ceiling collapsed, showering the command room with plaster and dust. The colonel staggered but stayed upright, blood streaking his cheek. "Get me the radio," he barked. But the radio was gone, smashed to pieces by the blast. Outside, Captain Mills's company moved street by street, clearing resistance with grenades and automatic fire. They advanced cautiously, knowing SS troops sometimes feigned surrender to ambush. Every shadow could be death. Yet what they found was less resistance than ruin. The once feared SS garrison was unraveling. At 09:30, a white cloth appeared from one of the upper windows of the town hall. A group of terrified young soldiers stumbled out, hands raised, weapons discarded. Mills ordered a ceasefire. "Hold your fire, watch the flanks." Then over the radio. "Possible surrender, but the HQ is still occupied. Keep eyes on the roof." Inside, von Richter watched the surrender through the cracked glass of his office. His hands trembled, not from fear but fury. The white flag waved where his emblem had once hung. For a moment he reached for his pistol, staring at it as if weighing the worth of his own legend. He could hear the Americans shouting outside. Engines, footsteps, commands. The sound of their confidence. It was the sound he had once mocked. Then came the final push. American engineers detonated the last barricade near the square, clearing the road. A Sherman rolled forward, turret aimed directly at the headquarters. Its engine idled, exhaling clouds of smoke that drifted through the air like breath from some great iron animal. Von Richter stepped to the window, defiant. He looked down and saw on the tank's side a small white star, the symbol he had ridiculed for years. And behind it, men in dirty olive uniforms, the farm boys he had promised to defeat. The realization came not as a thought, but as a weight. All the speeches, all the orders, all the dead, it had all come to this. He turned to his aide. "We have lost," he whispered. The words sounded foreign in his own mouth. Seconds later, the Sherman's main gun fired. The blast shattered the facade of the building, tearing apart the flagpole. The black SS banner came tumbling down, half buried in rubble. The roar of battle faded into echoing silence. In the courtyard, American troops moved in, rifles ready, boots crunching over debris. The once feared fortress of the SS had fallen without ceremony, without glory, without even a final stand worthy of its myths. The colonel, his uniform torn and dusty, descended the stairs slowly, like a man walking out of his own grave. And outside, through the smoke, he saw them, the stars and stripes being lifted toward the broken roofline, catching the morning light like a new dawn breaking over the ruins of empire. The headquarters had become a tomb. The corridors that once echoed with the stomp of boots were now filled with smoke, silence, and the hiss of fire feeding on papers and cloth. The black marble floor, once polished to reflect insignia and pride, was cracked open by shell fire, littered with cartridges and streaked with blood. Von Richter's last line had broken. Outside, American soldiers moved cautiously through the haze, rifles raised, helmets low. The air was thick with cordite and plaster dust and the sound of boots on shattered glass. They passed bodies in SS uniforms, some sprawled where they had fallen, others slumped against walls as if asleep. The resistance that had seemed unshakable hours ago had melted into scattered defiance and surrender. In the courtyard, a small group of GIs gathered beside a burning half-track. One of them, Sergeant Lewis, a veteran of Normandy, looked up at the SS building's ruined facade. "That's it," he muttered. "That's their nest." Captain Mills gave the order. "Move in." The platoon advanced, covering angles with quiet precision. They had done this dozens of times before, but there was something different about this moment, something final. Each step felt like the closing of a long chapter written in mud, sweat, and grief. They reached the entrance. A red banner, half-burned, still clung to a bent flagpole above the door. The once feared insignia of the SS, the twin lightning bolts, was now blackened and peeling from heat. One soldier tore it down without ceremony. Inside they found the survivors, young men barely out of adolescence, shaking with exhaustion, their uniforms soaked in sweat and soot. Some cried, others stared blankly at the Americans, their expressions emptied of hate, emptied of everything. The battle had drained them of even the will to curse. And then there was the colonel. He sat at a table in what had once been the map room, the walls pockmarked with shrapnel. His cap lay beside him. His face was pale, streaked with grime, his eyes hollow but alive. In front of him was a revolver, an elegant Luger, polished even now. He did not raise it. Captain Mills stepped forward, his weapon lowered but ready. "Hands where I can see them," he said. His voice carried through the room like the voice of inevitability. Von Richter looked up slowly as if waking from a dream. His voice, when it came, was calm. "So, the stars and stripes, I underestimated them." There was no arrogance left, only a faint, ghostly disbelief. He reached into his tunic, not for his weapon, but for something else. From the breast pocket, he drew a folded photograph, a younger version of himself smiling beside his wife and 2 children. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it on the table. "For them," he murmured. "I should have known when to stop." He stood, straightened his torn uniform, and placed his pistol on the table with deliberate grace. "I surrender," he said. The words echoed through the room, words the Reich had forbidden its soldiers to utter. They were not shouted, not forced, not dramatized. They were quiet, almost dignified in their smallness. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. The town was silent except for the soft flutter of a flag being raised. 2 American soldiers climbed to the rooftop with a folded banner tucked beneath an arm. It was stained, weathered, carried from Normandy to the Rhine, and now to this place, the end of the road. As they secured it to a makeshift pole jutting from the damaged roof, a gust of wind caught it, unfurling the stars and stripes over the ruins of the SS command post. The sunlight broke through the haze just then, and for a brief moment the red, white, and blue shone vividly against the gray sky. Below, von Richter stepped outside between his captors. He stopped at the threshold, eyes lifted toward the flag. The sight hit him with more force than artillery ever could. The same emblem he had laughed at days earlier now crowned his defeat. A soldier near him muttered quietly, "It's over." The colonel's gaze did not move. "Yes," he whispered. "It is." The GIs around him said nothing more. They didn't need to. Each of them had seen too much to feel triumph. Victory, they had learned, was often indistinguishable from exhaustion. In that silence, the war seemed to stop, not just in that town, but everywhere. The smoke, the rubble, the bodies, the broken glass, all were now witnesses to the moment when arrogance finally yielded to truth. A few hours later, the town was secured. Prisoners were marched out under guard. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars, and medics treated both sides without distinction. The Americans lowered their weapons, but not their vigilance. Experience had taught them never to trust the quiet completely. Inside the ruined headquarters, Captain Mills found von Richter's desk. On it lay the photograph of his family, the empty pistol, and a torn map of Europe. He studied the map for a long while, its borders drawn by men who no longer existed, its promises erased by 6 years of war. He folded the photo carefully and placed it back where he had found it. Outside, the flag still waved, its edges frayed but proud. It didn't just mark victory. It marked the battle had lasted less than 24 hours. By evening, the smoke cleared over the Bavarian hills, and the town that had been a fortress at dawn became a landscape of silence. The American troops moving through the rubble-strewn streets found more white flags than gunfire now. Windows opened cautiously. Civilians emerged with trembling hands and hollow eyes, clutching children who had not seen daylight in days. The SS garrison was finished. Of the 200 men under von Richter's command, fewer than 60 survived. Most had surrendered. A few were found dead at their posts, rifles still clutched in hands that would never reload. The colonel himself was taken into custody without resistance, his uniform scorched, his medals dulled by soot. Captain Mills filed the report that evening in the command tent pitched near the town square. Enemy headquarters neutralized. Resistance minimal after 900 hours. Approximately 60 prisoners taken, including one SS colonel identified as Otto von Richter. Civilian casualties moderate, local infrastructure damaged but serviceable. There was no ceremony, no grand announcement. For the men who had fought their way across Europe, this was another day's work. Another town liberated, another piece of the map crossed out in pencil. But beneath the procedural calm, something shifted. The Americans had seen hundreds of surrenders before, but this one felt different. Perhaps because of how the colonel had carried himself, not with the blind fury of a fanatic, but with the exhausted dignity of a man who had finally seen the truth. Or perhaps because the war itself was visibly dying now. Each battle was less a fight and more a cleanup of history's wreckage. That night, rain began to fall. It hissed softly over the ruins, washing soot and ash into the gutters. Soldiers huddled beneath tarps, cleaning rifles, lighting cigarettes, writing short letters home. They didn't write about the battle. They wrote about quiet things: coffee, spring, baseball, the wish to be back home before the leaves turned. Across the square, the American medics tended to the wounded, both theirs and the enemy's. In the makeshift aid station inside the church, an SS private lay beside a US corporal, both breathing the same air, both staring blankly at the ceiling where smoke still curled through broken beams. No one spoke. Words had lost meaning. Von Richter was kept under guard in a schoolhouse converted into a temporary detention center. He sat on a cot, silent, staring at the wall. When questioned, he gave only his name, rank, and unit. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't plead. A U.S. lieutenant noted in his logbook, "Subject appears calm, disillusioned." requests news of his family, provided no further intelligence. Outside, the Stars and Stripes still flew over his former headquarters. It had been replaced twice already, each flag shredded by wind and rain, but each new one was raised with the same quiet determination. The townspeople watched from doorways. For them, it was more than a symbol of occupation. It was proof that the nightmare was ending. In the days that followed, the Americans distributed rations and medical aid. They found evidence of forced labor nearby, foreign workers who had been kept in barns and factories under SS supervision. Their liberation brought tears and disbelief. They spoke of cruelty, of hunger, of beatings that had become routine. The GIs listened in silence, the truth of what they were fighting for crystallizing in every testimony. Meanwhile, the Allied advance continued. Patton's Third Army rolled south toward Regensburg and Linz. The 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions captured Dachau within days, exposing horrors that stunned even battle-hardened soldiers. The images would soon circle the world, forever marking what this war had truly been about. The small Bavarian town where von Richter fell became a waypoint, a name scribbled in war diaries, forgotten by history but etched into the memories of those who were there. At night, some soldiers returned to the square and stood under the flagpole, watching the fabric ripple in the rain. They didn't speak of victory. They spoke of fatigue, of home, of how strange it was to see German children playing again in the streets, and somewhere in a darkened cell. The man who had mocked that flag now listened to it flapping softly outside his window, a sound more haunting than any gunfire he had ever known. Survival, of men, of ideals, of the fragile belief that humanity could rebuild from its own ruin. In the days after the town's fall, the thunder of war rolled farther east. American and Soviet forces were closing on the same goal, Berlin. Each sunrise brought another report of a German surrender, another column of prisoners, another name crossed off the map. Within a week, Hitler was dead. Goebbels followed. The radio stations that had once promised final victory now played only static and foreign broadcasts. The Reich that had boasted of 1,000 years had burned itself out in 12. The U.S. Army established control across Bavaria with swift precision. Military police patrolled roads once lined with SS banners. Now those same poles bore Allied signs: caution, mines, surrender point, disarm zone. Civilian mayors were reinstated under American supervision, and white armbands marked those cleared to work. In some towns, German women hung sheets from windows as makeshift flags of peace. Von Richter was transferred to a prisoner of war camp near Regensburg. The Americans processed him like any other captured officer, photographed, fingerprinted, questioned. His rank carried no privilege, his titles no weight. Interrogation reports described him as intelligent, disciplined, and resigned. When asked about atrocities, he claimed ignorance. When asked about his loyalty, he replied only, "I believed in Germany, not in madness." The statement was typical of many captured officers, half truth, half denial. In the camp, time dissolved. Days were marked by roll calls and rations, by the rhythm of a world that had moved on without him. He spent hours writing in a small notebook, though no one ever learned what he wrote. Some said he prayed. Others said he planned his defense for trials he suspected would come. Those trials did come for many like him. At Nuremberg, SS leaders faced evidence that would shock even hardened soldiers. Documents, photographs, witness testimonies, an unbroken chain of horror. The ideals that men like von Richter had served were laid bare as crimes against humanity. He was not among those called to the dock. His role had been local, his hands not directly tied to the machinery of extermination. Yet history would not absolve him. He had worn the insignia, given the orders, enforced the silence. That was enough. Across Germany, the moral reckoning unfolded not in courtrooms alone, but in homes and streets. Teachers erased propaganda from textbooks. Civilians stared at Allied newsreels showing camps and mass graves, their expressions shifting from disbelief to shame. The illusion of noble struggle crumbled, replaced by the heavy question, how much had we known? For the American soldiers, the end brought its own burden. Victory revealed the scale of what they had fought against. Camps liberated, prisoners skeletal and silent, entire towns built on denial. Many GIs found it impossible to celebrate. Letters from home congratulated them, but the men who had seen what lay behind the Reich's curtain wrote only short, weary replies. The Bavarian town they had captured became part of the U.S. occupation zone. In the square, the flag still flew. Local children watched the Americans repair roads and distribute food. For them, the sound of tanks no longer meant terror. It meant bread. As for von Richter, he faded quietly into the records. By late 1946, he was listed among prisoners awaiting denazification hearings. His file ended with a single note from an Allied officer. Status compliant, unrepentant. History would not remember him as a hero or even a villain of great consequence. He became a symbol of something smaller yet more haunting, the ordinary face of obedience, the man who mocked until the world answered back. In the years that followed, that small Bavarian town rebuilt. The SS headquarters became a municipal building once more, its scars left visible on purpose. Each April, the local schoolchildren placed flowers beneath a plaque that read simply, "Here ended the war for this town. April 24, 1945, and above them, the same flag that once humiliated a colonel still moved in the mountain wind, not as a banner of conquest, but as a reminder that tyranny can fall, and that arrogance, in the end, always kneels before truth. History rarely ends with thunder. Most of the time it ends in silence, in the still air after the last shot, in the quiet steps of men walking away from something they no longer believe in. The fall of Colonel Otto von Richter was not the collapse of a single man. It was the collapse of an idea, the illusion of invincibility that had carried the Reich from parades to ashes. He had believed that brutality was strength, that fear was loyalty, that symbols could replace souls. But when the smoke cleared, all that remained was a man looking up at a flag he once mocked, and realizing it had outlasted him. That moment in Bavaria was only one of thousands across a dying Europe. Yet it captured something universal, the reckoning between arrogance and truth. Every flag raised, every town liberated, every surrender signed. Each was not just a military act, but a moral declaration. The stars and stripes that flew over the ruins of the SS headquarters did not stand for conquest. It stood for endurance, for the belief that the human spirit, though battered and flawed, could still push back against darkness. It was a banner for those who had crossed ocean's fields, and graves to make sure such tyranny would not rise again. And in the years that followed, as the ruins were rebuilt and the world tried to understand what it had done to itself, that flag remained in memory, not as a symbol of power but of responsibility. A reminder that victory is not the end of war. It is the beginning of memory, because war at its core is not about the weapons or the walls, it's about what survives when they fall. And on that April morning in 1945, as the stars and stripes rippled above a conquered emblem of hate, something greater than an army had prevailed. Humanity, bruised and weary, had taken one small step back toward the light.